Welcome to Good Life. I'm Dean Wilson. I'm so glad you're with us wherever you are. If you're here locally in Santa Barbara, California, on the airwaves at TV Santa Barbara, we welcome you. And for those of you joining us at goodlifetelevision.org or the YouTube channel or social media platforms, we welcome all of you. And of course, there is a podcast which is listed under Good Life Conversations. So you can find us at Good Life Conversations, and we see that many of you are from all over the world, so we're grateful, and we hope you continue to join us for just some amazing guests, amazing people, people doing great stuff, people with great life stories, great journeys. It's been really exciting to meet kind of one after the other. And so you can find all those long-form interviews again at goodlifetelevision.org, and then also now they're kind of migrating, finding their way over to our new YouTube page, and so you'll be able to see all of them there. We also cut them up into what we call power clips, so there's kind of some of the great moments and some of the great messages from those interviews are there as well. So love to have you join us at all those places. I'm really excited about my guest today. Jon Morse is with me. Jon, welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. Jon's had a very interesting and great career journey. He's primarily an attorney, an aviation attorney in particular. He's had a passion for flying. He got his private pilot certificate when he was in college. The funny story is when Jon was asked by his mother, "Would you marry an ugly girl if she owned a plane?" Jon's response was, "What kind of airplane?" Which I thought was hilarious. What was it about planes that got your attention early on?
Well, it's hard to say. I was an aerospace engineering major. I rationalized if I was going to design them, I don't know how to fly them. I've always enjoyed being up in the air. I was a pole vaulter in high school and college.
Oh, were you really?
Yes. So this was the next step in that career.
Wow. And so you've flown, have you continued to fly kind of throughout your life?
I've stopped flying. I haven't flown as a pilot command for about 38 years now.
Okay.
I've been there and done that.
Right.
But I taught my wife to fly, and we'd had a lot of fun experiences flying together.
Wow.
And she did not own the airplane, I will tell
you. And so you have an interest in piloting, and then you ended up going to work for, was it McDonnell Douglas? Or?
McDonnell Douglas.
Okay. And talk about that season of your life.
Well, when I was there, McDonnell Douglas was building F-4s for the Vietnam War.
Okay.
And we were doing research and development flight testing, putting new equipment on the airplane.
Huh.
And at one point, the airplane got so heavy with all the new equipment, they had to redesign the landing gear. So we had to do testing to verify that this airplane could take the pounding when it lands on the carriers with a lot of heavy equipment.
Wow. That's all the stuff that nobody knows about, that has to go on.
Right.
For everything to go right.
Right. Murphy's Law says you do one thing to the airplane, it affects it somewhere else. So that's why you do the testing. That's where you find out what something else is.
So you were an engineer? I
was an engineer to start with, yes.
What a fascinating thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so then what took you to law school?
Well, I was a charter pilot and I had too much free time on my hands. And I was thinking, what am I going to do for a real job when I grow up? And I looked at law school and I talked my way in. And in those days, they took you in, at the St. Louis University had an admissions process. They take your grade point average times 200, then they add your LSAT score. So I had a 3 flat, which is 600, and my LSAT was 650, that's 1250. And in those days, if you were 1300 or above, it was an automatic admit. If it was 1200 or below, automatic reject. I was on the waiting list. So I went and talked to the dean. I said, look, I think you got to count my 3 flat from Princeton a little higher than 3.5 from Podunk with grade inflation. And he agreed and they accepted me.
Wow.
And then the first day in law school, the dean told everybody, you can't possibly work and go to law school. I said, I have no choice, watch me. And I was a charter pilot. I volunteered for all the night flights. Those days we were doing a lot of flying for the car companies to carry 2,000 pounds of brakes in to keep the assembly line going. Because in those days it cost $3,500 a minute to shut down the assembly line.
Oh, wow.
So they didn't really care what it cost. So 3 or 4 nights a week, I'd fly from St. Louis to Detroit or St. Louis to Atlanta or Lubbock, Texas. And I thought it was great fun.
And you fly there and back?
I'd fly there and back. I'd get a flight out about 4 in the afternoon, be home at 1 o'clock, and
Go to school?
go to school at 10.
Oh my gosh.
Occasionally, I'd fly all night and go to class late. That was always fun.
Wow. And then so you come out of law school. Talk us through kind of this area of aviation law that probably not a lot of people know about.
Sure. Well, when a plane goes down, people tend to sue everybody that breathed on the airplane and several that didn't. So we would represent the pilot or the mechanic or the parts manufacturers that were being sued after a crash.
Okay.
And then we'd have to work with our experts, figure out what happened and whether there was liability. Sometimes it's obvious liability, you just want to settle it and move on. Other times, the liability theory was totally wrong, and it was our job to find it and then convince the plaintiff's attorney or the court, or in some cases, a jury.
Wow.
But people don't realize that most cases do not go to trial. About 98% of the cases that are filed end up settling.
Huh.
And in fact, the only time it really goes to trial is when one side or the other mistakes the value of their case.
And these trials go on a long time.
No, they really don't.
They don't?
Most cases, some of the big cases, you hear of the antitrust cases that go on 6 months or so. Most of the airplane cases are a week, 10
Sure.
days.
But weren't you involved in one that went on like 8 years? Or?
I was. I actually had a case in France. We represented a manufacturer of the electric hydraulic pumps on the Airbus A330 and the A340. And there were 2 instances where they had a fire on the ground that originated at the electric hydraulic pump. And so the airline's insurers paid the repair bills, more than $15 million for each airplane. And then they sued Vickers, pump manufacturer, and Airbus trying to get their money back.
Wow.
So it was a fascinating experience. It lasted 8 years. And with French counsel, I got to do the technical part of it. And it was the most technical case I've ever seen in over 40 years of practice. We got into hydraulic fluid chemistry and fluid flows and heat transfer and electrical circuit protection. It's fascinating.
Wow.
But the French system is totally different from the American system. In the American system, each side hires their experts and then you go to trial and you can try to convince the jury that you're right. In France, the court will appoint 1 or more judicial experts. So for instance, if it's a dispute about tomato farming, the court will appoint an expert in tomato farming who will gather evidence, write a report for the court.
Oh, really?
And in this case, we had a case that went all the way through the French court system. The French equivalent of a trial in a $20 million lawsuit lasted an hour and 40 minutes.
Oh.
All of the work was done by the judicial experts. We had a panel of 5 judicial experts because it was so complicated. We had a French accident investigator, we had a German engineer, we had an American systems engineer, we had a Canadian maintenance expert, and a French damages expert. And they would convene meetings in Paris or Toulouse or Jackson, Mississippi. But we also got to go to Malaysia and to Mauritius. And we had an agreement that whatever was said in the expertise meetings was translated from French into English or English into French, as it turned out. And we learned to like that because when Airbus would get on a roll, we could make them stop and translate, break the chain of thought. And when they were speaking in English, we were speaking English, we could watch the judicial experts' reaction. We get to see it twice, once in English, once in French.
Interesting.
But it made for some interesting mistranslations because one of the airlines was Air Mauritius. And Mauritius is a little island country in the Indian Ocean east of Madagascar, literally on the other side of the globe from LA. And while we were there, Air Mauritius was supposed to produce 3 other flight crews for interviews. They only produced 1, and I went ballistic. And I said in English, I've traveled about as far as it's possible to travel without leaving this planet, and I want to meet the other two flight crews. And it was translated into French that if they didn't produce the other two flight crews, I was going to go into orbit.
What was the response?
Well, they didn't produce the other two flight crews, but we ended up winning the case anyway.
Wow, that's funny. So your career, again, engineer, you've been a pilot, and then you've been an attorney, and you've kind of distilled some of what you've learned, some of on this journey that you've been on, into some life lessons.
I have.
And that you present occasionally at different groups. Let's talk about some of these, because I think they're really interesting. One of them is, if you keep making the same small mistake, eventually it will bite you. Mm-hmm. Talk about that.
Okay. We had a case, our mechanic was sued. The airplane crashed. Unfortunately, killed the pilot and his daughters in the airplane. So serious high damage case. But we did the investigation. We found out there was really nothing wrong with the airplane. What happened was that he mismanaged his fuel system. He flew into Fresno, topped off both tanks, and they took off. They flew back to Fallon, Nevada, and while he was in the traffic pattern, he lost power on both engines, and he fell out of the sky and crashed and killed everybody. Well, we reconstructed what happened. At the time of the accident, it was set to have both engines fueled from the same tank. The airplane is a very simple fuel system. You feed the left engine from the left tank, you feed the right engine from the right tank. There's an ability to cross-feed where you feed both of them. It's almost never used. In all my career, I think I've done it twice, and that was on a check ride to show I knew how to do it. So what we constructed was that he had the fuel set to feed both engines from the left fuel tank. The checklist says, before start, make sure you're feeding both engines from the same tank. So we obviously missed that. The pre-takeoff checklist says, make sure both engines are feeding from the main tanks. He missed that. While he was in flight, he was feeding both engines from the left tank. He would have had a very, very heavy right wing. He would have had to keep retrimming it. He obviously missed that. And then he got into the traffic pattern for his pre-landing checklist. It says fuel in the main tank. He missed it again. So he ran out of fuel at the very worst time because all the fuel from the left tank was gone. So he had so many chances to catch that little error, and it would not have been a problem.
Wow.
But looking at my life, one of our accident investigators we work with thought he had a great marriage until his wife cleaned out the bank accounts and left town. Turned out he wasn't paying attention to her, and he was not catching the signals. So these were little things.
Right. It kind of just a little bit at a time.
A little bit at a time, and eventually it all goes down the drain.
Interesting.
And I remember when I was married, our maid of honor told us, in a marriage, the little things are the big things.
Right.
You got to take care of the little things.
That's very wise. Very wise. All right, let's go on to another one. If you don't have to do anything right away, do nothing until you think it through.
Okay.
Talk about that.
Okay. This accident actually had a happy ending. Happened in 1965. It was a Pan Am 707 that took off from San Francisco, headed for Honolulu. He got up to about 800 feet, and the right engine had an uncontained turbine blade failure. It threw turbine blades out, cut into the wing tanks, started a fire. We know this because one of the passengers on the right side had an 8mm movie camera. He filmed the whole thing, and it literally cut off 25 feet of wing like a blowtorch. Now, the captain was up front. He knew something was wrong, but didn't know what it was. But normally, when you lose an engine, they say slow down to your best rate of climb speed. If he had slowed down, he would have crashed. But he knew to keep his speed until he figured out what happened. In fact, he kept his cool and he told the passengers, folks, we're having a minor problem. We're going to have to go back and land. And nobody panicked, including him. And so they managed to keep their speed, they got back and they landed it. And Boeing said afterward, if he had done the knee-jerk thing, he would have crashed. So what I've learned in my life is sometimes you have to do something right away. Most of the time you don't.
Yeah.
When I was a young lawyer, I got a really nasty letter from opposing counsel. And my first reaction was to sit down and write an equally nasty letter, which I did. But then I had the good sense to leave it in the drawer and think about it overnight. And I'm glad I did, because I would have started World War III. And I ended up having a decent relationship with the other lawyer.
Really?
And how many times I tell my clients, before you push the send button on that email, read it again.
Yeah.
Make sure you've spelled everything right. Ask yourself, are you willing to see this on the front page of the LA Times or blown up poster size in front of a jury?
Right. So
Because once you push the button, it's too late.
It's gone. That's very wise. Another one, sometimes you have to break the rules.
Okay. This one came from Switzerland. My wife is Canadian Swiss, and we have a lot of Swiss cousins, so we've been to Switzerland a lot. But Switzerland is a very rule-bound country. The standard joke is that everything is either required or forbidden. But this accident happened. It was a Swiss Air that took off from New York headed for Geneva. He got into Canadian airspace, and they had smoke in the cabin, which is a very serious problem. The idea there is get it on the ground now. But he headed back toward Halifax, and if he'd just put it on the ground, he'd have been okay. But he had a lot of extra fuel on board because, you haven't burned all your fuel to get to Europe. And the procedure is you dump fuel to get down to your maximum landing weight before you land. And he insisted on staying up there dumping fuel instead of landing. Now, if he had landed, he would have been overweight. He might have damaged the landing gear. He might have had a long rollout, but he would have gotten on the ground safely. But as he's up there following the rules, dumping fuel, he got overcome by the smoke. Everybody crashed. Everybody died.
Ugh.
So that's an example where you throw the rule book out the window.
Right.
You get it on the ground. Don't worry about being overweight. You explain that later.
Interesting.
But we did a project for through our Rotary Club for a charter school in Watts. They're preparing kids for school, for college. Most of them are coming from homes where they'll be the first to graduate from high school. But the principal had very strict rules, including a strict dress code, no gang colors. And one student showed up wearing sneakers in gang colors. And the principal dragged him into the office. He was ready to read him out. And he found out this is the only pair of sneakers the kid had. So he made an exception to that rule. So there are times when the rules are necessary, times when they're not.
Yeah.
I still remember in 1979, during the energy crisis, the government put out a decree that all of the federal buildings were to be kept at a maximum of 77 degrees to make sure you cut down on air conditioning. The trouble is, in Alaska, they had to turn the heat on to comply with that. One of the few times the government came out quickly with a variance for
Sometimes
the
you
rules.
ask for permission and sometimes you ask for forgiveness.
That's right. That's right.
Accidents happen quickly and unexpectedly. Be prepared.
Well, throughout my career, I would say that most of the cases I've seen, people get on the airplane, normal, happy, healthy people. They have no idea that they're going to be dead before they get out of the airplane. The question is, do you have a will? Do you have a living trust? What's going to happen to your family? Most recently, I took on a case pro bono for a lady who lost her husband. He died in the crash. He only had $100,000 insurance per passenger and didn't have any insurance. So when he died, his Navy pension was wiped out. So all she was left with was what's in his estate. And the plaintiffs on it wanted more money than $100,000, and I had to bargain with them to convince them that she's a victim too. And we ended up settling it so that she could keep something to live on.
Wow.
But this is a case where if the guy had thought it through, he probably would have had a life insurance policy
Right.
to make sure his wife was taken care of.
Right. So planning, preparation.
Planning and preparation.
So let's end with a happy story since we've had a couple. What did you think about the Sullenberger deal?
Oh, he did great. I didn't watch the movie because I know the NTSB did not try to make him the scapegoat, but they did that up for
TV.
for TV.
Movies, yeah.
But no, he did a magnificent job. He lost power. He put it down the only place he possibly could have. So he was an absolute hero. But that's what pilots are trained to do. They're trained to keep their cool under fire.
That's another. I mean, that. Well, you say that, but I mean that kind of presence is something that you train for that, don't you?
You train for that, but it's necessary that you have it when you need it.
Right. But what a great lesson for life. I mean, as you're talking about here, I mean, I think about my boys or, people that I care about. Nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, boy, what bad thing's going to happen to me today? I mean, you don't, sometimes I think we don't train young people well enough for suffering or difficulty that's going to happen.
That's right.
It happens to all of us. Relational issues, financial issues, crises, natural disasters. I mean, things happen. And to have that kind of presence, that kind of, where you really are trained, okay, so when something happens, I stay calm, I make good decisions. Sometimes I break the rules.
That's right.
But having that kind of seems like a great idea for everybody.
It is. So these life lessons are not just for pilots,
Yeah.
but for everybody. We can learn things from these accidents.
Yeah, it's so good. What a career! You're very interesting. You probably know that already.
Well, people ask me if I'm afraid to fly, and I tell them no. It's really a very safe way to travel. In fact, it's probably a lot safer than cars.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is, there are probably 50 car accidents within 100 miles last night. We probably don't hear any of them. And yet, if there's an airplane accident anywhere in the world, you'll hear about
You
it.
find out, right?
For example, you may remember that 8 years ago, the Malaysia Airlines airplane just disappeared without a trace.
Yes. What happened to that?
Well, that's very interesting. After 2 months, all the experts were saying we'd never find any part of that airplane. And about a year later, a piece of the left wing washed ashore on Réunion Island down in the Indian Ocean, right next to Mauritius.
Really? I didn't hear about that.
Yeah, and I really wasn't surprised at that at all, because Réunion Island is a part of France, and the left wing is always showing up in France.
That is good and true. Wow, what a way to end it. I can't resist, but what happened to that airplane? I mean,
There's going to be a lot of speculation. I think that was the pilot intentionally crashed the airplane.
yeah.
That's the only thing that makes any sense. Yeah, in the ocean. We'll never know where because there's so much ocean and it's at the bottom of the ocean. And they were just happenstance that part of it washed ashore. So we know it went down.
Yeah. I remember that was a fascinating. There's so many theories. For a while I was following all the theories about where was it parked in some hangar and wherever.
Oh, there were a lot of theories.
Yeah.
Everybody had a theory on it.
Yeah. That was it. Well, it's great to meet you. What an interesting career, great life lessons. Jon Morse is my guest, attorney, aviation expert, interesting guy. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.